Hey y'all, I'm Ashley, a black woman and forever a black girl from the south side of Chicago. Growing up, the women in my family taught me the importance of creating my own space to cultivate joy and express my creativity. I found that space at the skating rink. The skating rink for me was a portal that transported me back from girlhood to the infinite possibilities of being a black woman and back again. I rolled through the sounds of black music while the bright lights illuminated my dark skin as the cool air brushed through my coily hair, giving me a sense of what freedom feels like. Just like the wheels of a roller skate, our lives take us on new journeys. And my journey has led me here to the Rolling Archives podcast, a digital scrapbook of Black girlhood, a celebration of the magic we are made of as we float through the ups and downs and journey through Black girlhood on our own terms. Hey y'all, so I'm gonna ask you to roll with me probably a little bit slower today. It's a big conversation today where we'll be talking about grief. And I want to be super open, honest, and transparent with you all as I share some of my own experiences with grief. I can think of two major examples that have stood out to me more recently, but also in the past that continue to return to me as I navigate my own grief journey. And so the first one, of course, is from my grandmother. She passed in April of 2012, and she is like a deep inspiration for everything that is the Rolling Archives. I think that I went to graduate school and I learned about Black feminism formally through that training, but she is the epitome of what a Black feminist is and looks like and stood for. And she wouldn't call herself a Black feminist, which is really interesting, but her power and her presence exude everything that stood for who we are, celebration of who we are, but also being honest and being real. And so growing up, she was one of the most important people in my life. I adored her. I looked up to her. I grew up in her home on the south side of Chicago. It's through her where we would oftentimes learn. She would teach me actually how to garden. And so her backyard was just full of rose bushes and flowers and just all the things that make you feel like breathing and air would come easily. There was so much greenery in the space, so many colors, and I think about that a lot. And even if you visit the Rolling Archives website, a lot of the images and the photos that are there are actually her flowers and her plants from her garden. And one of them that I actually took when I was a little girl. So I try to hold on to her memory in a lot of ways through even the physical representation of the podcast and of the Rolling Archives. But she also taught me, even though this part didn't really stick, but she taught me how to bake, and we would oftentimes cook together. And I am not a chef at all. I do not enjoy cooking, but something about it when I was young and doing it with her and her letting me like taste everything before it went into the oven or eat all the rest of the icing out of the bowl as she was creating the beautiful pastries or the beautiful cakes that she was making that felt so special to me, and I'll always hold on to that deeply. She was top tier of fashion girly for sure. She was always the best dressed in the room when it came to our us going out to events or hanging out with family members. She was just always the one to show up, and she made everybody else show up and be stylish and fly as well. She was extremely funny, and I will say I think that's where I get my own sense of humor from, but at the same time, she had a very sharp tongue. And so you would not be playing with her. You would not be playing with her kids. You would not be playing with her grandchildren. Like she would let you know very, very quickly and put you in your place. She would get you together. Um, Something that I think is so important that I often think about is she would often encourage all of her grandchildren to be educated. She didn't get to be educated much further beyond an elementary school, middle school, high school degree. And so she was really all about having us be educated and to go as far as we could go. And so I actually graduated from college right before. After, excuse me, right after her passing. And I feel like that's probably as far as she wanted me to go, but she doesn't know this, of course, but she inspired me to continue my education all the way through to the PhD. And so, if it had not been for her and her letting me know that I could do this, that I am smart, right? That my education, there's power within that. I don't know that I would have even chosen that path for myself, but I feel like she planted those roots for me really, really early on. But I will say there was like a very slow grieving process that I experienced with my grandmother because she endured multiple strokes. Which later on like removed her ability to eat and her ability to drink. And so I watched this very beautiful and very powerful woman kind of slowly decline as relates to her health. But something I do remember when I would have to visit her in the nursing homes or wherever it was I was visiting her, she would still be there. So sometimes we would say like blink your eyes if you can see me or if you know who I am, and so she would blink, and that would be like, okay, she's there. Like she knows what's going on, even though this is a very difficult time for her. Or sometimes we might try to prompt her to smile. And she gave us like the deepest eye contact during those visits, too. And so I do hold those with me, but I will never forget the day that I received the phone call that she had passed after almost 4 or 5 plus year journey of her being sick. And it was in the middle of the night, and I just immediately went to the nursing home that she passed, and I witnessed her in her final moments. And it's just an image of her that often comes back to me. And so my grief process feels just as raw today as it did back in 2012, especially when I think of her. And so once her physical presence left this earth, I also feel like it was time for me to go. And so I actually left my home of Chicago, and I actually have not returned to live in Chicago since then. One, because of opportunities haven't presented itself, but I do think that her absence makes me feel a sort of absence in the place that I've always known to be home. And so, something that's really important before she lost her ability to speak, one of the last things she actually said to me was, "Take care of yourself." I will never forget, I was getting ready to go back to college. I had came home to visit and I was on my way back out the door, and I just wanted to say goodbye to her before I left. And she said, "Take care of yourself." And so, I'm not perfect. I don't always do what I need to do, but I try to make sure to take care of myself, whether that's just in the reflective check-ins, the physical, the mental, right? And I struggle, but I do try to make sure I do this because this is what she wanted me to do. And I thoroughly believe that sometimes taking care of ourselves is also honoring, right, that memory of the folks who deeply loved and care about us. And so in 2025, I also experienced another wave of grief that is still here. It's very sudden, but I lost a really close friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Gwen Baxley. She was a professor, but more than that, she got her PhD before I did. And so she was kind of like an inspiration for me. We went to graduate school together, so she knew me throughout my entire journey as a graduate student. But outside of graduate school, we just built a really beautiful friendship and a really beautiful sisterhood. She's someone that I can never ever forget her presence because she was very quiet and soft spoken. She had the most beautiful voice. She was a poet, so she could like read down the the world and how it actually was. She loved all things Black Panther Party, community schools, Black youth. Like that's what her work was about, but also she genuinely absolutely adored understanding our history as well. But it was just always the ways that she showed up. Although she was very quiet and soft spoken, she had the loudest and the calmest presence ever. We oftentimes would go to conferences together. My fellow academics are familiar with AERA. Like we would go there every year. Sometimes we might stay in a hotel together or whatever. But it was always just about those mundane moments of us hanging out, laughing, just having a good time. And so my grief continues to return to me after her passing in October. I deeply, deeply miss her. And I think that my grief always I think that my grief always asks me, how could I have shown up for her more? And so I'm in a place where I'm constantly writing and writing articles, and I had got a revision for an article like November, I believe. And I opened the article and I was like, trying to make these quick revisions. And I realized I cited a piece of her work. And so that was just one moment where I felt like she came back to me, like, I'm still here, sis. Like, I got you. And so I see my grandmother, I see Gwen in my dreams. They often return to me. I think about them weekly, if not daily. My grandmother, when the person was preparing her for her funeral, they talked about how there were so many butterflies outside of her window. And so sometimes when I'm on a walk or I'm just kind of, outside doing my thing, there's been butterflies that are like flying right at me and right towards me. And one time, one actually like ran into my face. But I just hold on to like those moments. Butterflies mean so much to me now because I feel like that's just her checking in again. And so I'm going to ask you, as you listen to this episode, how has grief changed you? How have you tried to heal? And how do you navigate your grief when it returns? And so today, I'm so very honored to welcome a fellow sister scholar, a soror, and just a really beautiful person, a Delta Sigma Theta, and just a really beautiful person and someone I do consider to be a friend, Dr. Taryn T.C. Brown, who is an assistant professor at the University of Florida and teaches schools in the society program. Her research centers on university community based youth initiatives with a focus on youth led research and research literacy development. She highlights how race, class, and gender shape educational reform by positioning young people as knowledge producers. Grounded in Black feminist thought and critical qualitative methods, her work amplifies Black women and girls' voices and advocates for justice oriented research and training. She founded the Black Girlhood Collaborative, which is dedicated to research and learning on Black girlhood. And so, hey, Taryn, how are you
Hey
feeling
girl,
today?
I'm doing
So,
all right. I'm doing all right.
that's good. I'm so happy to have you here. I will say that I distinctly remember several moments with you,
Mhm.
and always at a conference, of course, but there's been
Mhm.
several times. But the one that stands out to me most is when we were invited to do a panel together at ARA,
Mhm.
and your
Mhm.
work on Black girlhood and grief. It,
Mhm.
it honestly like
Mhm.
shook me, but so much of it when I was learning about your own personal narrative and how you have also
Mhm.
navigated grief, it was just so beautiful and so powerful. And I've actually carried that with me in my work.
Mm.
I think a lot of times we talk about like how Black girls, are whether it's adultified or forced to mature. And so they like grieve this sense of girlhood that is oftentimes stripped away from them. And so I think
Mhm.
about that a lot in my work,
Mhm.
and especially with the Rolling Archives, because I've been trying to create a space where us as Black women can hold on to, return to, or even just remember some of those moments. But
Mhm.
something that's also really important is that we also just talk about the grief that we've experienced. And so I'm really
Mhm.
grateful that you are here today. I know that we are grieving a lot, many things,
Mhm.
often
Mhm.
daily, with all the
Mhm.
information and the triggering news that we are confronted with. So I wanted to just make space to talk about grief today and how we can
Mhm.
navigate that as Black women, girls, and femmes.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So I am actually going to ask you to roll back with me as well. So thinking about young Taryn.
Mhm.
And so one thing I want to know is, what is a core memory for you as a Black girl that either stays with you or just keeps returning to you in the future?
Uh, uh, wow. So first, I want to thank you for your vulnerability and just sharing that. I'm looking forward to the conversation because we don't get the opportunity to be in spaces and carve out what we need to engage in the way that I hope that we are supporting and kind of caring for each other, even in this short time that we'll have today. So I wanted to lead with that, and I I'm sitting with the core memory, and I'm going to immediately lean into my memory work with probably the most significant loss I've had in my entire life, which is connected to my mother. So I lost my mother in 2019. What's super crazy is that COVID hit in the next year, like in that March. I lost my mother like 4 days after Christmas in 2019. And so when I think about anything connected to memory work or core memory, she's always intertwined in some way. I feel like our stories overlap because she was also a no nonsense. Okay, she was gonna get you right. She was gonna make sure that we did what we were supposed to do. She grew up in rural Bluff City, Virginia. So if you know anything about, the rural parts, people say I'm Southern. I know I have a Southern dialect, but if you have ever been to the rural parts of Bristol, Virginia, those folks got a Southern dialect that is like no other. And I just remember her telling me about her childhood as heavily informing how she mothered me. And I also think about how that shaped, again, those parts of my core memories that stand out the most. And the through line of those core memories are that my mother always wanted me, whether she had me engaged in anything girl centered. So I was a Girl Scout, YWCA, anything that was like Black women and Black girls, movies, film, arts. She was like, you gonna be there. She wanted me to see things outside of myself so that I could see the reach of possibility. So similar to your grandmother, right? There was a push of like, I got you, I'm here and I've gotten you here and I want you to go beyond me. And I think about that through line of every core memory being that push that I felt when she would have me leading, probably I was a Girl Scout award winner, right? So most Black girl, you don't see big work on Black Girl Scouts that last all the way through high school. I say that all the time. Like I was a Girl Scout all the way to the end and got the awards on the back end. And that was her, right? So she was a part of those experiences that really challenged me to not feel unseen, even though many things outside of ourselves would suggest that. She also pushed me to think about how I could see myself as curious. I could be the question asking Black girl. I could be the capable Black girl. Um, my One of the things I also share is my name is Taryn. I always say Taryn T.C because I'm Zimbabwean. My dad's from Zimbabwe. My mother is from rural Virginia, so they met in college. So my maiden name was Njagu. So I also was like when I was in school growing up in the rural South, I was the African Black girl. So I felt sometimes outside of the loop. I was in the loop, but outside of the loop. So I also was doing some identity development stuff where I felt other sometimes and not a part. And so I feel like also part of those core memories that stick out. And that through line is like her prompting of me to know who I was, to stand confident in who I was. And even in those moments where I was unsure, to know that she would always be there to reassure me. What else is coming to mind for me? With my mom, I'm also thinking about um, her supporting me in my like skill sets, whether it was performance, whether it's speaking, whether it was drawing. I mean, mama had me with the little at home acrylic nail set. She was like, you want to play with nails? Okay, let me help you. Anything I wanted to do, she was going to support me 1,000%. And so I just sit with that because in my loss of her at such a significant point in my life, um, I have two little ones. I have a son. I have a son, Dorian, and a daughter, Harper. My daughter had just turned one, and I lost her at a time where you think about if you're also when you are a mother, when you lose your mother and you are a mother, I feel like there was also some unpacking that I'm still working through, even as we're leading up to Mother's Day. As y'all are listening to this, we are leading up to Mother's Day. It's such a significant part of my negotiation with loss and thinking about just how intergenerational that experience feels when you lose someone that is such a marker on any core memory, anything that I could name, she would be there. And then I don't have that in the same way anymore. So that's what immediately comes to mind. It's not a very direct core memory, but it's the acknowledgement of the through line of my mother that informs any core memory, even the ones that had formed after her, because I always lean back into her name was Georgia K. Birdwell, double name Black girl too, Georgia K from the South. And she is that for me and will always be, even though she now sits in my embodied memory.
Thank you so much for sharing. We want to hold Georgia K here
Mhm,
today. I
mhm,
really, really
mhm,
appreciate you sharing. And it's just so beautiful to hear about her and just all of the ways that she was there, right? And I feel like
mhm,
that's so important for us as Black girls. And I don't know what it was. I'm thinking about your mom, but also my grandmother. Like,
mhm.
what it was that just allowed them or inspired them to be a force, or if it was just
Yeah,
like inherently in who they were, but
yeah,
they knew that we would need that type of care or
yeah,
that type of like nurturing and that type of
yes.
being seen
Mhm,
and like that type of affirmation that
mhm,
has allowed us to like still carry that on even though their physical presence is not here. And so
mhm,
I really resonate that with that so much, and I find that to be so powerful. And I really appreciate you sharing that too.
mhm,
It is Mother's Day coming up. I
mhm.
agree with you even as a newer mother too. Like I always think about like what if I could have one more conversation with my grandmother
Yes,
about this
yes.
mothering thing? Like
Mhm,
what would she tell me? Like how would I
mhm.
but I think I've been trying to carry on her legacy. My grandmother's name was Princess, and so my daughter's middle name is
Mm,
also Princess, and so
mm,
yeah, it's just been like carrying that on. But I also love sometimes when we hear core memory, we're like, let's go back to that one instance. But I love that you're like,
mhm,
nah, it's actually going through so many memories, right? Like that's
mhm.
how big your mother's presence is, was, and
Yes.
continues to be. So I
Mhm.
really, really love that. How would you then describe Taryn as a
Mhm.
result of whether it be your mom, but also when you just think about your younger self, how would you describe you?
Um, I think again, one of the things that I feel like I'm absolutely an empath. I'm deeply emotional and connected. I feel like and extremely collective too, right? So anything that feels transactional, I don't gel the best just because I'm so deeply empathetic to experiences outside of my own. I really, again, back to mama, we were the house also that everybody came to, like Thanksgiving. People were living with us at different points of my childhood. Like we were that house that everybody came to. And I think that care was placed in me, right? So when I see and feel and understand circumstance, I carry the emotion of it. And so when I think about even young Taryn, I was trying to figure out how to navigate that, right? I still figure as a grown up in my big age now. How do you also think about the necessary boundary and care for self? I heard you say that too. Like, what does it mean to attend to that when you naturally have a personality or a characteristic that cares so much and carries circumstance, lived experiences, community, challenges, harms, right? You pick those things up and I feel them as if they are me. And I think I struggled as a young person, as a young girl, trying to make sense of myself in that way because I don't know if I knew as clearly what to do with it, like what it was, like what was it about me that could see other people's circumstance and feel almost like a responsibility to said thing, right? Whether it was the homegirl, right? We doing, we had to figure things out, right? So whether I was trying to help them or it was something that was happening in society or something that my mother had exposed me to. Again, she kept me in girl-centered things. Your girl was watching Roots as a little girl and Queen and Women of Brewster Place and all of the black films that like showed circumstance outside of my own. I realized I think there was an intentionality in like that exposure. I think even to kind of sharpen myself to see those things and to truly have because there is I think about the fact that I have that and I assume that most people move in the world in that way, but they don't move in a way that carries other people's burden or that carries other people's circumstance or humanity, if you want to say it in that way. So when I think about myself young, it was really trying to sit with that part of me. So as somebody that uh, saw themselves as an empath, as somebody that carried emotions, um, uh, very personable, again, very relational, very, very oppositional to anything that felt like we weren't going to build a relationship. And I had to kind of work through that for myself. I think that it also informed what I chose to be a part of when it came to organizations, when it came to clubs, when it came to family. Even now, when I think I'm also the person now that has to plan all the things, and I'm like, I don't want to plan all the things. I want to go to the things. And my cousin, that's like a sister, we call each other sister cousins because we grew up like sisters. But she's like, that's you. Like, I don't know when you're going to walk into it, but it's always been you, even from my girlhood, like that's always been me. And I think it's true. I see it, but I fight it. So I think about that also being something that when I have to think about my girlhood, it was being the person that gathered, that cared, um, that loved to be in community, that loved to be with family. Similar, you talked about sitting and listening to your grandmother. I love to sit with the grown people and hear them tell story after story about they got and my mother also had an interesting childhood. I think that's why she framed my girlhood in the way that she did. So she protected me. So I don't even think I knew all the things. Now that I'm an adult, I'm like, dang, they had a lot going on that they had to work through in a way that she tried to shield me from me not going through those same circumstances, or at least again, seeing the possibility beyond of like what options we had. So that also informed the drive that I think I have I'm a middle child. So I could also say middle girl, good, bad, or indifferent, however you see middle children. However you see the middle child, I am the middle child. I stand in it. So my older brother and I have a baby sister, but we all were were at least able to get into my baby sister's 9 years younger. So she lost my mom a lot younger. I think about that too, like the age of us losing our mother and what we had been able to experience or yet to experience. But she formed our childhood in such a way that we had the freeness that we needed. So I felt that. And then we also had the protection to like limit us from things that she felt like we didn't need to hear or see. But the ability to stay anchored in family and tradition, which was sit and hear those family stories and those things that we used to be like, "What? Outhouse? We had no electricity. We had to go out to the country and do X, Y, and Z." Like those are things that now folks are like, "You did what as a child?" I'm like, "Nah, mom, we knew all of that in the US South, growing up and hearing her stories to my story." So those are some of the things I think that come to mind for how I would think about defining characteristics of my girlhood, childhood.
Yeah, that's really amazing. So, I'm just thinking, like, I'm kind of seeing this thread, but I hope that you will maybe like make it clearer for us. But
Mhm.
you're talking about like young Taryn, the empath, the one that shows up for everyone, that creates community, that builds, right?
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
at the same time, you're like deeply curious and you want to know like why
Mhm.
things are happening this way, why is this going this way? But then you're also like soaking in the community that was like naturally forming, whether
Mm.
it's like through your mom
Mm.
and your family and like hearing their conversations. And then we get to Taryn today, right? Who is
Mhm.
like building all of these things, right? Very much
Mhm.
so from an empathetic place. Like I can only
Mhm.
imagine someone who does work with and alongside Black girls and about Black girlhood has a level of empathy and
Mhm.
understanding about life that
Mhm.
is different. It requires a different kind of orientation to the work, right? But
Mhm.
also, right, to understand Black girlhood and their grief, right?
Mm.
I feel like that empath of Taryn, young Taryn, has like kind of brought us to this moment. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm curious to hear what you think about that. But if you could share your journey into this work,
Mhm.
and then into the field of Black girlhood studies, but also just
Mhm.
doing this work alongside and with Black girls.
Yeah. So some of even what I've shared before, like the entry point into Black girlhood, absolutely was mama kept me in Black girl centered thing or girl centered things and traditionally Black girl centered things. So and I don't even know if I named it like that, Doc. If I knew that that was happening at the time, I just knew she was like, "You're gonna be in Girl Scouts. You're gonna be over here in the Boys and Girls Club. You're gonna be over here running this, being in this program," and not recognizing that she was being very intentional about my placement. And one of the things I didn't get to, Phew, one of the things, so my mother passed in 2019, in December, and it was my first semester of my faculty line. So I graduated with my PhD in 2018. Then I had my baby girl Harper in August, 5 months pregnant, walking across that stage, child. So if you're a mommy out there, trying to make it work, I mean, pregnant, trying to figure it out, you can do it. Okay. So I walked across that stage, and so she was there, had my first semester, and she passed in that first semester. I didn't get a chance to share with her that her mothering of me has informed everything that I do. Because I don't think I knew it in that way. I was just kind of walking in it. And you said the same thing about your grandmother. I didn't get a chance to directly say, like, "Oh, you had me at the plays. I'm watching Queen, Brewster play." I mean, I just was dissecting anything folks that teach and sit in Black feminists, Black girlhood spaces. These are things that we use as tools, right, to like explore like lived experience. And my mother, similar to your grandmother, maybe not by language. Like, I don't know, she would have called herself a Black woman. She might have called herself a Black feminist. I don't know. She definitely would have said she was a revolutionary because sister didn't play. She didn't play about them politics, but I didn't get a chance to say, "Mama, like, this is what I'm doing. Like, I'm a Black feminist scholar. I sit in these spaces with these dynamic women that do this work that's informed heavily by like what she planted in me." So my Black girlhood entry point really was at um, that intersection. I remember starting my um, PhD. And originally, I've always been into like access, retention, community building for Black students. Started my program, and social foundations is my degree, social foundations of education. And I remember meeting with the advisor, my initial advisor at the time, and she was like, "What is that? Like, when you're thinking about your question, like, what is it that you want to center?" I just like Black youth, just pretty broad. And I started talking about the fact that, I had friends when I was in high school that became mothers younger than the typical timeline. And I was the godmother of two. And so I remember just sitting casually with that advisor, and I'm telling her these stories about like, yeah, and the school's doing this, and they, omitted them from that, or they not letting them do this. And she was like, "You're very passionate about like the school's negotiation with these young mothers," and like, and although at the time, again, this is the beginning of my program, I didn't have the language, I didn't know about theories and frameworks as explicitly as I know them now to name systemically what was happening to people that were near and dear to me that had become mothers outside of a typical timeline, and then the ways in which they then had to negotiate space and perception and all these different things, right? So that's the language that comes in my graduate program that I was storying though through my lived experience, having come from a community where there was a boom. There was a lot of young mothers at the time. And I was like the person, again, the empath, a care. I'm a godmommy. They big and grown now. I mean, they're getting older, graduating from high school. But at the time, I just saw something was wrong and I didn't quite know what was happening. And then boom, like that became my dissertation topic. I wanted to understand experiences of Black girls, particularly at the intersection of Black girl, mother, and what that meant. Because even for those of us that look like the same people, we also perpetuate the same harms around different entry points and value structures that we might attribute for how we see things. So that then became my work and my ability to study and understand that there were scholars like your Ruth Nicole Browns that had been articulating and naming things, even if you want to go back to girlhood and bell hooks, like they had articulated, like something was happening in the nuance of being at the intersection of Black and girl that also needed to name a thing. So then that's when I feel like I picked up the work, um, made it, my dissertation, studied it, came out of graduate school, and then first semester faculty law, mama passes in 2019. Unexpectedly, my mother was only 59 when she passed, so she was very young. Um, and so it rocked my absolute world in a way that I'm absolutely still dealing with, and will forever and always deal with because of again how I've articulated she was to us, who what she meant to my family. She was the matriarch of my family, not my immediate. The family. She lost her mother when she was 16. So there was also an intentionality about loss, her losing her mother at a young age. And then I now realize, core memory popping up, Dot. I'm thinking about my first time coming home after I had my oldest son. I had my son at 27. And I came home for the first time. I'm from North Carolina. That's where I grew up for the most part, is North Carolina. So I come home and and my husband, we pull into the driveway and it's like 1 o'clock in the morning and she's standing on the porch and she was crying. And I was thinking to myself, so then I'm like, girl, what's wrong with you? Get in the house. It's 1 o'clock, mommy daughter banter. I realize now she's probably thinking I get to see it was the first time I had came home with my son because we lived in Atlanta. So I realize now that's my baby. I get to see my baby come home with her baby. She didn't get to have that, having lost a mother at 16. And how significant it is intergenerationally to be able to see your child bring their child home and for her to experience what it means to be a grandmother, which is also that's you get to get upgraded, to grandma status. It's a different experience. And I know at the time, I know now, Dorian's about to be 12. But I know now that that's what that was for her. Why she was emotional in seeing us pull into the driveway and staying up to see us make it from Atlanta to North Carolina to see her baby. So I just think about that just popped into my mind, and maybe that's her, like, you know, I think she's like, "I'm here, Tara. I'm here. I know you're
Yeah.
doing this, in this interview." So she's talking to me a bit, but I remember she's standing on the porch and she saw me kind of walking up. And that's a significant part of just some of the things that I see differently now as adult Taryn, that I in my memory work, which is a process in my grief negotiation, I've started to lean more into, because I feel like I lost my mother at a very young age. Dorian was 5, Harper had just turned 1, brand new faculty line, thinking my mom made it. I made it to the PhD like you wanted. She always had big hopes for me and my siblings. We've all accomplished in different avenues, and I didn't get to have her for that moment. So what's crazy is you bring up that panel, and I was a ball of tears
Mm.
during that. And I couldn't even do the conference for the rest of that doc. So after that session, what Ashley's sharing is we had a panel session. We were invited, and I presented a paper called "Grieving Black Girlhoods." Um, my dissertation topic that centered young Black mothers. Of the Black mothers that were in my dissertation, 2 of them had lost a parent. Okay, I hadn't lost my mother at the time, but I noticed significant intersections of like their mothering and their sense making and their identity as intertwined with this loss, right? And so I remember immediately losing my mother, and sitting with the grief for myself and recognizing that in the silence, I started to ask my questions. I started to sit with, I think that, I don't know if that's the academic, I don't know what it was. I just started to sit with questions like, what does it mean to grieve, in a world where you're not supposed to show vulnerability, right? My mama equipped me to be strong, but I also needed to be vulnerable enough to reconcile, like, this part of me that I had never experienced before. Mama passed. I took like a month off, maybe a couple weeks off, and I was back in the classroom. Why? Why did I go back in the classroom and teach? I did. I went back. I remember my colleague like, "You want me to take your class?" And I was like, "No." I just put on something to not sit with the silence and the stillness. And it wasn't until I did that Grieving Black Girlhoods emerged. It really pushed me into like wanting to understand grief. It pushed me into thinking about what does it mean to create spaces around acknowledging grief as like a form of knowledge. And so that presentation, that conference was so challenging for me. After we finished, everybody was so loving. I remember we were there together. I met in person. And I went back to the hotel room, and my husband had sent stuff to the room. I don't know if he had anticipated it's gonna be hard for her to do this. And I just bawled my eyes out for like the next overnight, and I flew back the next morning back to Florida. But there was an exhale there. And I think that was the entry point into the grief work. Like what happened when I sat with myself to story my grief negotiation alongside having sat with I have 4 mothers that beautifully shared their story with me for my dissertation. And I was sitting with their work with my own grief negotiation and saw such a through line in like loss and transition and emotional labor and just what it meant to like have time and space to sit and think through that. Um, um, and there was a exhale in that paper, and honestly, a community I think that did start to form. My colleague that's at University of Connecticut is in counselor education, and she's on a second paper actually that we wrote as an extension to Grieving Black Girlhood. It's called Grieving Out Loud, and we're trying to think about responses to grief negotiations, because I do think, as you said, Doc, it's an ongoing journey. It's so where I feel like I've sat now in my entry point into grief scholarship is sitting heavily with the limitations of how it's looked and felt in the busyness of our current reality, and really trying to reconcile and create capacity for young girls and women to deal with what I think is most often overlooked, which is the everydayness of grief, even like today, like leading to small things. Like for me, you said butterflies. For me, it's a cardinal. I'll step
Mhm.
outside and see a cardinal sitting in a tree. I'm like, after Mama passed, I had seen no cardinals in the state of Florida. I feel like until Mama passed, and now I step outside and it's always one sitting in the bush outside. And I'm like, okay, hey mama, get it together. She's like, all right, Taryn, let's go. Let's get it together. I will share. I know I talk a doc. You can cut me off, but I'm gonna share this one last memory in the loss for me because you shared that moment you got the call. About your grandmother. For me, it was 4 days after Christmas. We and my siblings, I have a brother in Philly. I'm in Florida. Well, at the time I was in Atlanta and my sister was in North Carolina. So 3 different states. For whatever reason, she had to have it was a everyday procedure. She had to go in and get something and come home. That's what ended up being the thing that took her life. But we never come home all together for Christmas. Like it was rare that we would all be home. Something was like, we gotta come home. This is before the procedure, so we ended up having a Christmas, all of us together, my big brother, my baby sister, me, my kids at the time, and, I remember the night before she passed, the day before, because I didn't get to get final words. That's something I think about. Like you said, what would she have told me? I didn't get to have last words with my mom. We were watching a film, Black History as She Did. It's called Mandingo, actually. It's called Mandingo. And I'm sitting on the couch and we're watching this movie. I'm thinking, why are we watching this movie, sister? Because it's an interesting storyline. And we're sitting there, and it was almost like it's something about when people, I don't know if they're in their last part, they just start. She was dropping seeds like, you know, I want you to go get this. She shared something that was put away. She said, go get this and bring it. I want to show it to you. Right. Who would have never seen it in my life? She told me exactly where something was. It's very significant because in her loss, I would have had no idea that this particular family heirloom was where it was. She also was saying things about like, yeah, and when you do this and when you think about this, and she was saying words. That was the night before. I got up the next day. I went to see my friends because I was home. It was North Carolina, so I went to see my college friends. I never got to speak to her. I saw her again in the hospital. She was still alive, but I never got to hear her voice again. So my last touch point with my mother was watching the film, which is crazy because doing the thing that she used to always. I was the only sibling that would sit down and watch the black movies, and watch the films and ask questions with her and be excited about going to plays in the way that she really wanted me to be. And I think that was significant. And I've been trying to also reconcile in the grieving out loud and the grief negotiation the moments that we did have. I also am a very faith filled individual that's also guided in that way. And so I do know that there's opportunities to sit with those memories as also a compass for myself. So also the grieving work prompted me to think about how do we create capacity for acknowledging the knowledge production that is grief negotiation and that it could be varied. And the traditional grief literature would say that grief has a beginning, middle, and an end, and it doesn't. And in our community as Black folks, we are expressive, right? We are communal, right? Most traditionally, we are collective, right? And the grief scholarship doesn't explicitly speak to those kinship traditions that are part of us. And so I also appreciated some of your sharing of how you're working through and taking your everydayness in the grief negotiation. Because what you see in the scholarship that pertains to us as Black women and Black girls, that we're not represented in that way. And so that's the work that I've sought to sit with, and continue to sit with, because I think there's something to live it and then to connect it to have as an entry point for like the authenticity of what the work looks and feels like.
Yeah, so there's a lot there that you shared that I kind of wanted to sit with. Like,
Mhm.
first is like the moment that your mom passed was also just such
Mhm.
a critical transition point for you. Like, for folks that
Mhm.
aren't familiar, like being a professor in your first year is probably one of
Mhm.
the most hardest year. Like, people always are
Mhm.
like, don't expect to get anything done as it relates to research because
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
demand of like what is required of you is so intense. And
Mhm.
so to experience grief right at that moment, like,
Mhm.
is adding another layer. And then soon after we go into 2020, right? And then the
Uh-huh.
pandemic brings its own
Mhm.
level of like grief and silo and aloneness
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
all of that. And you're still like newly in motherhood in a lot of ways.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I wanna, like, hold that space, right? And then something that you said was like, I don't wanna, like, misquote you, but basically, like, you went right back to teaching soon
Mhm.
after because
Mhm.
the maybe it was even, like, the sitting with it was just a little bit too much, and
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
resonate with that so much because after my grandmother passed, I moved from Chicago. I was like, "Alright, this is the sign
Mhm.
that I'm supposed to go somewhere else," so I went to Syracuse, started my
Mm.
master's program, so I, like, transitioned to this whole brand new place. I mean, I went to college
Mhm.
in Chicago, grew up in Chicago, so to, like, just
Mm.
drastically go to
Mhm.
New York State, like, I'm not talking about New York City, but, like,
Right.
upstate New York was just like, "What am I doing?" And then,
Mhm.
like, at the same time entering a master's program, it was just, like, a huge transition, but I felt like I was running away from my grief, and
Mm.
so
Mm.
now even what is this now? Year, like 14, I'm not good at math, but she passed in 2012, and, like, every summer I've been feeling it now, like, my semester is ending, and I just feel a
Mhm.
deep sadness, like, I feel a
Mm.
deep heaviness because it's like I'm
Mm.
not go, 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 I'm not super busy, and so I
Mhm.
all the grief of everything that I was able to escape returns
Mhm.
to me in the summer, which is such a very
Mm.
difficult place to be because it's like, it's bright outside, it's sunny, it's
Mhm.
beautiful, right? Like, it
Mhm.
I wanna go outside, but then I don't wanna go outside because I'm, like,
Mhm.
stuck in so much grief, and I feel like I've been, like, feeling that more recently with, um Gwen, but also with my grandmother, and just, like,
Mhm.
I lost my dad during the pandemic too, so it's just, like,
Mm.
to your point, right? Like, grief does not have a beginning, middle, and end. It, like,
Mhm.
is so nonlinear. It returns to
Mhm.
us in the most unexpected and sometimes what may feel like the most inconvenient ways. Like,
Yeah.
I can't deal with this right now, right? But, like,
Right.
for us as Black women, Black girls, Black femmes, you've
Mhm.
mentioned already, but also what I kinda learned through your work is, like, as with other things in the academy, right? Like, Black women and girls are completely overlooked in the sense of
Yes.
like how they grieve, what their grieving
Yes.
looks like, the
Mm.
uniqueness, right? And then coupling that with the societal pressure of like,
Mhm.
we just have to push forward, we just got to be strong.
Mhm.
And I want to actually mention something that you quoted. You said, obviously, we're often measured by the level of pain that we can endure,
Mhm.
and then also how good we are at masking our grief. And so
Mhm.
I think that it's really important to not invisibilize the
Mhm.
grief journey. And I love that you call
Mhm.
it a journey because it is a back and forth and right back around again. But I was just
Mhm.
wondering if you could share more about this and how do you wrestle with this deep complexity and the tension in the work of grief scholarship, the tensions of
Mhm.
how Black women and girls are always often dismissed or invisibilized, and then
Mhm.
still are able to show up and do this work of like grieving, which I'm sure you're also navigating that at the same time as you're writing it and engaging in the work.
Mhm.
So yeah, I just was
Mhm.
curious if you could share more about that.
Yeah, so I think about the grief scholarship that I and there are some dynamic also scholars that that have sat with grief negotiations and Black women. I'm so appreciative to their entry point. One of the things I also feel like I feel different sometimes because I sit in curriculum and instruction, but my work is social foundation. So I'm often having to look for colleagues in an interdisciplinary manner, right? Because I feel like my people they're in education because people are like, "Oh, Black Girlhood's education." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm in education, I'm in curriculum instruction, but I jam with everybody, right?" Like, I feel like my people are in counseling, they're in your field, AFM, Black studies, they're in gender studies, all these different spaces where we're able to think about the different layeredness of how we've made sense and asked our questions and perspectives and bring them together. So that's one of the things that I think about when I also have been able to sit with the grief scholarship is just how interdisciplinarily it sits as work, but how I think it feels siloed in like traditional Western orientations to grief and our process. So again, we talked earlier about no beginning, middle, and end, no stage, timeline, and resolution to the process, right? And I think about kinship traditions, which is attributed to us as a people, black folks, black people, black girls, we naturally again are communal, and the process that would suggest a stage, a timeline, and a resolution might not have the necessary breathing room. It might give capacity, maybe, but it might not have the breathing room for the embodiedness that is Black women, Black girls, that is sitting with some of the ways that we express ourselves. I write in that piece, Grieving Black Girlhoods, equal parts joy and pain, right? So I can be happy and sad, and both of those big T truths can exist at the same time for me. And that doesn't mean that there's a resolution, right? That just means that I'm sitting in these two emotions simultaneously because the process of grief is complex and layered and nuanced and specific because it's deeply human to who we are. And so, in the context of Black girls and Black women, I think that capacity building, as you're doing with this beautiful podcast, is like bringing us into a space where we get to talk through it versus sitting in um, the busyness of what it means to sit in academia, to be and do and engage with research and scholarship. There's a pace to that, to this world that I also struggle with. I also struggle with, in particular with this work. I mean, it took every part of me to do that first presentation, and I'm slowly but surely. I've actually been tasked. There is this forthcoming special something with the grief work, but it can't be rushed like everything else feels rushed sometimes. So I'm just slow pacing myself with what that looks and feels like, but I think it's trying to stay very intentional to grief for Black women and girls and the embodiedness that we get from scholars that encourage us to sit with memory work, to sit with what your work is doing with the archives, to sit with the memories, to sit with the photos, right? You articulated like these images that we see that evoke a feeling or an emotion that also are part of our processing as Black women and as Black girls. And so I think about this work for me breathing in that way. And so, in a way that would trouble dominant paradigms, that would lean more into productivity than into the care ethic that is truly a Black feminist care ethic or a womanist care ethic that would say there is also growth in the slowness of a
Mm.
process. And so that's also been significant for me. And the work is like, being tapped to come and talk or share. And I'm like, no, there needs to be a slowness and a rush. And again, my sister scholar that wrote with that with me, Dr. Latoya Haynes Toby on that second piece, she also has just a care. Like she's just wonderful in like noting that we are co-writing and engaging together, but also we pause. Like, I need a minute. This paper gonna have to sit for the rest of this semester. This paper gonna have
Mhm.
to just wait a minute because I just need to sit because I think we don't have to replicate. One of the things I'm coming to terms with, Doc, too, is we don't have to replicate the ways in which I feel like Black folks or Black academics have had to exist in the system. I'm not naive that we have to acknowledge what it has meant and felt like. But we also could choose to stand flat footed and disrupt how we choose to embody our praxis, our pedagogy, our research, and our scholarship in a way that is more reflective of how we show up. And so I think about my grief scholarship as sitting in that, as creating opportunities for that. I've done it with young people, which is even more where there's even more of a necessity to have a care ethic. They're young, there's a developmental intentionality around like, what does it mean to talk to young people about loss, right? And you also mentioned loss. One of the things I've been thinking about, and it's in that second piece, is troubling loss as loss of a physical person. You said that, right? Like also loss of timeline, loss of. I think it's also important. COVID hit. I needed that COVID, honey. Being home 2 years right after mama, because I went back and taught, but then COVID hit. So I think the Lord was like, shut the world down because she ain't gonna sit down. The world just shut down. And so I was at work and I remember taking my computer. They're like, oh, you'll come back in 2 weeks. No, we didn't come back for dang near 2 years, after that. And I think that was intentional. Like, you're not gonna slow down. So I'm gonna make you slow down. And recognizing that I needed that. And now that we're back to this pace, what do we do to create capacity in grief scholarship for Black girls that we intentionally carve out spaces like you're doing today with us talking on this podcast that I seek to do with the young people that I work with? If they mention that somebody passed or that they lost something, that I give attention to it, right? I don't skim past it. I do come back to it and recognize that there's something that might be more deeply there that we need to create presence for, that doesn't shy away from the uncomfort of someone articulating a loss, but that lets you sit with it, feel all them feelings, drop every tear, and do what you need to do. And we can come back tomorrow, right? I think that's troubling, the pace of what we have to work through and what I have hoped and am hoping for this work to continue to build towards.
Mhm. Yeah, so you talk a lot too, which I think is super important. And I think that you are encouraging us to return to is like our inherent ways of knowing, right? Like we
Yes.
both talked about this with my grandmother and just some of the things that she was doing that
Yes.
honestly has been the building block for so much that I do now, whether it's in my mothering, but also in my teaching and my scholarship and my research, how I even see Black girls, right? And so
Yeah.
much that your mother was just like naturally immersing you in, right? That also is really rooted in the work that we are doing now. And it's something that you describe as like, our, whether it's Black folks generally, but also Black women and girls, as our inherent ways of knowing, right?
Mhm.
Our inherent cultural knowledge that can inform a lot of our moments of grief, right? Like we do
Mhm.
have our very own special traditions, right? We have
Mhm. Mhm.
very important and like cultural ways that we honor, that we celebrate, that we remember, right? And so
Mhm.
you are actually kind of pushing us away from the way that the world tells us to grieve and just move
Yes.
forward into like what we have already always done, and what we
Yes.
continue to honor in that work. And so I'm really curious about a few things, but first I'll just ask about the memory work that you're talking about. And for the
Yeah.
listeners that may not be familiar with that, and you also
Yeah.
talk about embodied memory work. So what does that look like in the
Mhm.
everyday, especially for yourself, but also in your research that you found working with Black girls? And how has that, just kind of shaped their grieving journey, grief process as well?
Absolutely. So when I say embodied memory work, it is to recognize that grief lives within. And I also articulated like the idea that what is often the most overlooked is the everydayness of grief. So if grief lives within, and we know that there is an everydayness with grief, to sit with an embodied memory work is to feel the body and to create capacity and space for you to feel and allow the body to feel without judgment, right? So when I was mentioning before, like, feel those feelings, not to move at the pace that I think that society, and culture sometimes presses us to think about grief, right? There's not a 2 week break on the back end and then it's done, right? There are moments that trigger, right? There are things that remind you. And so to consider embodied memory work is to sit with the ability to feel the body, to feel yourself, as an embodied experience, because your body is going to respond to the everydayness of grief. And I had to learn that for myself. Again, you heard me start with almost a silence where I didn't do it well. I didn't do it well, right? And I still figuring it out. And I also would say then the next step of that is thinking about um, the community or the collectivity of the grief process that's also there. So the people that I've surrounded myself with that acknowledge that, because also depending on where you are in your professional trajectory or even the communities that we sit in, if there is not a community or grief space that would encourage that, then you're not going to feel the necessary embodiedness that needs to come with sitting with the memory and the grief that you're working through in the everydayness of the grief process, right? Um, for the space that you need to remember that grief also is knowledge production and yours might look different. And if you have people around you that are cultivating that, you can sit in that, right? And you can name that more clearly. And so when I think about my work with my young girls and the work that I've been a part of, it's been thinking about opportunities to again model that. And I'm modeling it because I've lived it, right? So when I think about embodied memory work, not only did I learn the language of what it means to feel it in the body, right? To sit with the equal parts joy and pain, but to also model it in such a way that it becomes practice for, I mentioned my daughter, right? I want her to see. She's also an empath because so if she sees me sitting, sometimes I sit in a stillness and she'll say, Mommy, like I think she can feel me, right? And so I do believe there's a part of me that still even feels parts of my mother in the memory work, right? When I sit with being able to name the story I gave earlier around recognizing like there was an emotionality behind being able to see your daughter coming home with your child. I didn't at the time know that that's what was happening, but that's what was happening, right? But my embodied memory work of that more of that memory then gave me space to think about like what was also happening, and I felt that and I recognized the lessons learned. So also what I think is beautiful by acknowledging grief also as a journey is that there's lessons along the way. So not only are you reconciling and engaging with self to give yourself the ability to sit with what comes with the memory work, the healing that sometimes comes in the memory work, there's been lessons for me in that. Like you said, Doc, like I hear my grandmother telling me this, right? I know my grandmother would. She didn't get to see this part, but I know she would, or she's guiding me in this, or this butterfly came. You know, you hear people telling stories about that sometimes casually, but there's such significance in those things that are inherent to our communities where we pay attention also to the body and the things around us, nature, the things that we see, the breeze in the air. Like I have wind chimes. My mother's quote when she had a sister circle call, they called themselves the dynamic diva, the divas, right? And so when Mama passed, they are like they stand in her proxy, so they make sure they do all the things that she would do. And so they gave me wind chimes, and I'm sitting at my home office, and it's right outside the window. And so they don't ring all day every day, but every now and again, those wind chimes, if I'm having a tough day, those wind chimes, are singing to me. And I'm like, okay, I hear you. But that's me paying attention to and remembering how to grieve and recognizing that in those small nuggets, there's also learning. And I think about our work with Black girls as encouraging them to feel and see that. And I don't know if they get, again, models to see it in that way. I think they see a rushed, fast paced movement and even a shying away from how to deal with it. And I think if we model also more as women, so that's what's important to me and my daughter. Because I also wonder, because my mother lost her mother at 16, I don't think she really sat because she immediately was pushed into like the oldest sibling of four. So she became like the mama. And then she had to help raise siblings, things something I didn't have to do, right? But that she didn't get to really sit with. And so I think she was really journeying through her grief when she was seeing her children grow up, when she was seeing us graduate, when she was seeing me have a baby, right? And her becoming a grandmother. She was journeying in her grief, recognizing that she didn't get to have those experiences. Again, embodied memory work. She was allowing herself to experience that. So when I think about recommendations or thoughts for grieving Black girlhoods in particular is thinking about the language of embodied memory work. So making space in your body is thinking about how do you identify those spaces of grief and remembering the collectivity of community that's significant. And it's also recognizing that your grief negotiation is knowledge production. So it might not look like my cardinal or my wind chimes, but it could look like stillness. It could look like a walking of a park, walking in a park. It could look like a breeze that just makes you feel like alive again, right? It can be whatever it needs to be, but what has to also exist at the same time is that you're creating capacity for it to be, which means to trouble dominant ways of knowing when we think about grief negotiations and scholarship. So I'm learning to do it still every day. But I've been so appreciative and grateful that this work for me has been expression in the research space, but also healing praxis and an embodiment of truly authentically Black feminist and girl centered ethic, which I think is what we're reading in the scholars that we stand on, Doc, that I think is modeling that for generations to come.
Yeah, so this is really important because I feel like you're also shifting us from like seeing grief as this like haunting thing that just won't go away and like
Mhm.
it's so just always like heavy and dark and inescapable, which in a
Mhm.
lot of ways it can be, but it's also I love how you are calling it like a space of knowledge production. It's
Mhm.
also a space of healing too. Like,
Mhm.
what do we
Mhm.
gather when we just kind of sit in it? And as you
Mhm.
say, like make space for it when we return
Mhm.
to community in it.
Mhm.
Because when I was reading about like the memory work and grief through your work and like the embodiment of it, I was only thinking about like, oh, you just go back to the like memories that you do have. But it feels like you're also saying that it's
Mm.
okay to sit with the memories that we never will have, right? Thinking about,
Mm.
oh, I won't get to,
Mhm.
experience my grandmother as a great grandmother, for example,
Mhm.
right? Like my
Mhm.
daughter Naomi won't know her outside of just the photos. And so what does it mean for like me to tell her about my grandmother, but her to never really experience her, or maybe she does, and I just don't. It looks different, right? But it's
Mhm.
in like sitting with the moments that we don't get to have with them
Mhm.
as a part of that grief, but that creates a new opening for the
Mhm.
lesson, right? Like my
Mhm.
grandmother wasn't able to see me attain a PhD, but she was definitely there, like
Mhm.
in the rough
Mhm.
moments, in the hard moments, and so I think that that does help with the healing too. So I really, really appreciate that. And um at the same time, you're like encouraging us to see um ways that I guess our grief and our grief journeys can lead us into like these moments of
Yeah.
perhaps healing and liberation. And so one thing that
Yes.
really, really stood out to me was like the ways you talked about Afrofuturism and
Mhm.
like this idea of Black feminist futurity, and how it
Mhm.
allows us to imagine a present that we want to see today. And
Uh-huh.
so how we can also engage in like creating a present that we want to see today, even in our
Mhm.
grief.
Mhm.
Um, and so for me in the work, it's been like creating the very spaces that my grandmother created for me with and
Mhm.
alongside other Black girls, right? Like that's my
Mhm.
like using my grieving of her not being here, engaging in that memory, whether embodied or otherwise, right? Because she can't be in the group spaces that we co-create,
Mhm.
but like she's
Mhm.
very much her presence is there. And so
Mhm.
I was just curious about your experience in like building and imagining what you want and what you hope for, even
Mhm.
when you are grieving.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up because it does remind me that also the catalyst for what comes from the processing of space making in the grief space realm for Black girls is the language of what could be, right? So I just feel like I've sat with so many thoughts around um, scholarship that is traditional Western centered grief scholarship that would say grief negotiations or grief journeying is too much, right? Or it's too complicated or it can't be too different, right? And what Afrofuturism, I think, troubles is just unimagined possibility for what it can look and feel like in a way that lets you also be a part of that world making experience, if that makes sense. So, like, Afrofuturism to me also was a framework, a perspective, a tool, a resource for me to think about beyond. I'm not meaning to put that thumbs up, my hands. But uh, paper grieving Black girlhood, I was absolutely in a dream space. Again, I went and took myself and put myself in conversation with my co-researchers, my girls, right? That had lost that I didn't have the language for or the emotionality in the same way that having lived through it, then recognizing this other thing that was happening. And so to some extent, um, going back and it's almost saying and it's almost saying that's almost Sankofian, right? Sankofa, right? Like this looking back of this moment to consider the present and a movement forward. Afrofuturism then gave me language to not only consider future casting, but also the imaginative possibilities of things that we might not even think about at all, right? Like what does it mean to grieve out loud? Like and to do it to suggest grieving out loud is not only a painful experience, to suggest that grieving out loud is joy, that grieving out loud can be infused in our everyday, in our schooling practice, in our community, both informal and informal spaces of learning for our young people, to suggest that it doesn't have to be that thing that people get hesitant around, right? That we create breathing room for emotion to sit in a way that it doesn't have to shut down because it's too different, right? Or because people are uncomfortable. I think about Afrofuturism as the tool that for me helped me create or think about language that there isn't a right way to grieve, right? There is your way to grieve, and there's my way to grieve. And that all of those things, again, that's knowledge production for me became central because it just created the capacity for like all of these things to happen simultaneously. And when I think about what we say all the time in the Black girlhood space, like Black girlhood is not a monolith, right? Grief is not also either one singular way of being, right? And it can exist in many different ways. And what's been washed out in traditional grief scholarship is the cultural, the ancestral, the personal practices, the things that allowed for the nuance to be the mode of expression for our grief, to suggest that we now move in a very singular way. And when you study us as a people, because we are so diverse and wonderful, we move and express in many different ways. It's dance, it's song, like so that's also something that's become a part of this work too, is to trouble Western oriented definitions of grief scholarship and to look more broadly across the diaspora around grief practice, because what is significant culturally, ancestrally, that have been washed out of what we navigate still exists very much so in other contexts in ways that we also need to be thinking about. And so for me, not having that language has also pushed me into that space, right? To think about some of those modes of taking the language of embodied memory work and care ethic, and to consider how it is understood in these different cultural contexts that still own and embrace their tradition in a way that hasn't washed out kinship tradition, right? I'm not suggesting that it's all washed out, but I've seen more exemplars of what is more aligned with this grief scholarship for me that sits across our Western dominated frameworks and tools. So I also am reminded of that and encourage those that might be hearing some of these terms for the first time or even considerations of world making Afrofuturism. So I also consider how you're thinking about your ideas beyond a Western centered ideology to a more Afro diasporic, Afrofuturist realm that lets you build a world that pulls from these different places that responds to the needs that you might need in your grief negotiation.
Mhm, 100%. Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown too. And also just like the recognition that we our grief looks different. It made me think even in the South, specifically in New Orleans, and like how they
Mhm.
do
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
parade and like the big
Yes.
celebration too,
Yes.
and like wearing white, and you know what I'm saying? It just is like all these different ways that inherently in our culture, like in our community, we do have a different experience of grieving. And I know
Mhm.
that one of the things that you had wrote in your piece too was like making space in the body obviously is important,
Mhm.
returning to community and finding that
Mhm.
community to share these grief traditions, but then also remembering how to grieve, and
Mhm.
remembering like what is like ancestral and like central to like how we as a community
Absolutely.
build and gather and celebrate, mourn, right,
Mourn, yeah.
grieve. But there's like a togetherness too where the world kind of, in a lot of ways, it encourages us to like isolate ourselves in our grief. Like, can't let
Mhm.
nobody see
Mhm.
me sad, can't let nobody see me
Mhm.
down.
Mhm.
But actually, like, your sadness is actually deeply also intertwined with mine, and like
Mhm.
we can talk through that, we can build through that, and like we can imagine right through that. Even in the modeling through this episode, which I really appreciate,
Yeah.
is like the way we've been going back and forth, just sharing the memories that we have of your
Mm.
mother, of my grandmother, right? And I think that's like that's powerful. I honestly was nervous to record this episode. I told my
Mhm.
producer Triple before we started. I was like holding off on even like developing the intro because I'm like I just
Mm.
don't feel like
Yeah.
I can do this. And like talking to
Mhm.
you, I actually feel so much more rejuvenated and like so much more
Mm.
energized. And I think you're modeling that for like us, for me to like remember that it's
Mhm.
okay and we got each
Mhm.
other and we
Mhm.
are here in both the joy and the pain, as you said earlier.
Mhm.
So I really,
Mhm.
really, really appreciate that. Um I was wondering if outside of that, if you had any other like pieces of advice or encouragement that you could offer to Black women and girls and femmes who may be struggling in their grief journey today that we haven't already discussed.
Um, Again, I think I'm just gonna go back to the ability to sit with there being no right or wrong way to grieve. Grief also means that there was a love there. And what we also beautifully see in Black feminist scholarship is the power of love and care. Um, and not only a romantic love, like a love that is like, like no other. I mean, I think there's something to be said about feeling grief in the heaviness in various ways because there was something that was there and an acknowledgement that it's okay to sit with that. It's okay for that to be something that you're trying to figure out. It's okay to not feel like that you're going to have to do it a particular way or that it has to mirror those that are most immediately around you. And so when I think about again my own journey, um, I've had to think about also what are those traditions that I am. I love that you brought up the piece around like how do we make sure there's an intergenerational component also to grief, and recognizing that a trigger for me is in the loss, like what I feel like I don't have, but then I have to think what are the lessons, what can I push forward? So like, what are some of the ways that I'm building that, and I don't know what it'll be tomorrow, but there is a part of me that has this desire, and I can also sit with this want, right? That also sits with my grief that I can figure out for myself too. So I think about yeah, just really encouraging sisters, community members, anyone that's listening to um, recognize there is no right or wrong way, and that it absolutely is a journey. There doesn't have to be an end. There can be a lull, right? There can be a moment that it shows up and is operationalized in different ways. There can be a moment where you do feel like you gotten to the other side of a thing, and that's fine. I think that the word process for people um, makes you feel like the emotions stay constant or that it's a similar pace, and process to me could feel like it goes down and it comes up, and or that maybe at some point it's quiet, but that doesn't mean that it's not a process. Just because it feels quiet, it's just a part of your process, and being able to name that for yourself. And I am speaking as a person that is walking in the everydayness of grief negotiation. And so yeah, seek that community, engage, figure out what are those things, those cultural practices, what are those memories, what are those things that you can do, and disrupt typical negotiation. I just disrupt. I mean, I struggle with that because I think that most traditionally what is modeled is the opposite. Um, and so sometimes folks are like, "Why are you?" But you have to figure out how to trouble some of that. My students are like, "You say trouble a lot, Dr. B." But you have to trouble that. You have to trouble that. And that means sometimes it's people are not happy. That means sometimes some people will leave. That means sometimes that, whatever boundary or whatever thing you need to put in place to work through that might disrupt something that feels like the most consistent thing for you, but it might not be the best thing. So you have to figure out like what that looks and feels like because I love where you started too with the healing part of the process in this long life and long journey that we're trying to sit in. It's like how do we care for ourselves? And a part of caring for ourselves is also as we're getting I mean my girls lost their parents young, you still have to walk this thing. And so there does have to be an acknowledgement of care, which means that you do have to sit with these questions for yourself. So I would encourage people to sit and think about what that looks and feels like. And for us as Black girls, to lean into much of what we've talked about today and to find that community that can support you in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that so much. Thank you so much, Taryn. I do have a question.
Mhm.
Bringing younger Taryn back into the room, um, how do you think she would, if you could speak to your younger self or just see your younger version of yourself at any stage of what you might consider to be your younger self, the young Black girl who would one day do the work that you are doing, what do you think she would feel about everything that you have done or are continuing to do? And maybe even on the flip side of that, is there anything you would want to say to her?
That's a good one. Um, yeah, I think if I was speaking to younger Taryn, little black girl with the long name, Taryn, Tanasha, Chimwanda, Ida, and Jagu Brown. I had all the
Yeah.
alphabets, all the alphabets. I would tell her, or as I sit with her, everything that I felt, everything that she felt, everything that she noticed, every question that she had, all of those things mattered, even in moments where she might not have thought they did. Um, I would tell her in like trying to fit in, trying to figure out how to maneuver in spaces sometimes, maybe feeling othered, depending the context, that she was never too much. She was very largely loved by so many people, and that she was becoming and was always becoming exactly who she was supposed to be. So everything she felt, everything mattered, good, bad, or indifferent. Everything mattered because it informed and was a part of exactly who I'm still becoming. I'm still becoming. So I still sit in my black girl one word, shout out to Sister Scholar. Because I'm still becoming, but it has informed exactly who I need to be today.
And who you are today is also deeply loved and appreciated. I
Thank you,
truly,
Doc.
truly love you. Um, can you just share? I wish we didn't have to wrap up
I know.
because I have so many more questions, so many more things. But could you just share maybe what you're working on now, something that is
Yeah.
currently exciting your work, and then also where folks can go to stay connected with you?
Yes, thank you, Doc. So currently, what has commanded my attention? I'm still sitting in this grief space, absolutely. So working on some collaborative projects, trying to sit with myself around what this work means. I also do a lot of community engaged research with some local schools. So I do youth participatory action research. So I run a program called Girl Talk at a local alternative school for girls where we do beautiful work and do YPAR and all kinds of identity exploration work. Also been working on taking the YPAR. I've kind of co-developed or built upon some YPAR curricular design and have worked to develop a global YPAR network. So working with some international collaborators on what does it mean to do YPAR across the globe. So I have some dope scholars and friends where we've been ideating. We did our first round this year with partners in the UK. But the idea is that what does it mean to take our US based Black girls and put them in conversations with Black girlhood across the world and to put them and develop skill sets in research literacy where they can identify the problem, take the method to design the way we work, right? Like, I'm like, dang, if I would have known you can figure out a question, develop a research design, and try to respond like these processes that we do at 10, 11, 12, 13, teenager, So I'm very excited about that global WAPAR work. And then the last thing I'll mention is similar to you, Doc, I am sitting in the historical methodological space. I have been supported by my institution to do some global feminist work. So I went to Zimbabwe in 2024 and sat, my grandmother is 91. She'll be 92 on my father's side. And she was a teacher. So she was a teacher in Zimbabwe pre and post independence. So had the opportunity to go and like now's the time. Like I'm recording her, filming her, asking her all the questions. Even when I think about my mom, like I'm like, dang, I should have asked. So I'm sitting with her. So that's another project that is a slow project because it's so deeply personal in a way that I'm having to work through some internal things too with that work. But it's that my sister scholar Tiana Dowie Chin is her name, she uses the language grandmother epistemologies. And I think that that's beautiful because there's so much we learn, like you're saying, from our grandmothers that inform us also. So that's the third thing that's kind of commanding my attention. If you want to find me, we have a listserv through the Black Girlhood Collaborative, which is the research group that's been around for a little while. We send out newsletters. If you have work that you want me to hype up, I'm all about like, how do we lift up this work? Because we're here. It might be one or two of us at our institutions, but we are bigger. We are big and mighty. So, the Black Girlhood Collaborative seeks to like uplift scholarship in Black girlhood as well as to create community. We send out newsletters. We also have an Instagram page where we do like collective conversations around like text and write-in time. So that's how you can find me if you want to connect.
Yes, please follow the Black Girlhood Collaborative. We're gonna have you on
Mm.
for another episode just to talk about all that beautiful work that you are doing there, for sure. But thank you so much, Dr. Taryn Brown, for being here
Mhm.
with us today. This has been such a beautiful and much needed conversation. And I think I will return to the question that I presented to the listeners at the top of the episode, thinking about
Mm.
how has grief changed you? How have you
Mm.
tried to heal? And how do you navigate grief when it returns? And I think honestly, truly
Mm.
today, I'm learning that grief is something that is ongoing and that it is okay to talk about it. So thank you, Dr. Taryn, for really giving me the space to also grieve out loud with you. I'm going to
Mm.
uplift that as you encourage us to do, which is to grieve out loud, but also to disrupt in our grief and remember that we are collectively brilliant and beautiful people, and
Mhm.
ancestrally we do so much healing, experience so
Mm.
much joy even in the sadness when we come together. And so that is something that I want to share with the listeners today.
Mhm. Mhm.
I also just want to thank you all so much for listening to today's episode of the Rolling
Mhm.
Archives podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and on YouTube at the Rolling
Mhm.
Archives, all one
Mhm.
word. And then you can also find us on our website, therollingarchives.org. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and like and
Mhm.
share if you are on YouTube. And we will be back with another episode in 2 weeks, y'all. So until then, may we just keep rolling towards all the places that keep us whole and remember to hold on to our grief journeys, not run away from them, but also know that we can build together to create the type of healing and the type
Mhm.
of world that we imagine. All right,
Mhm.
y'all. I'll talk to y'all soon.